Michigan, and we're going to give a short lecture on Palouse Basin boundaries. The photograph you see is actually over in the Colfax area, which is outside our boundaries. So that's a little give an idea where my thinking come from. I like to go look at the rocks. This is the Palouse River, about 7 miles north of Colfax, and the bottom outcrop there you see is the uppermost Grand Run. In the trees, if you walk up through the tree zone, you're walking through parts of the Vantage member, which is only a few feet thick. And then the rocks off in the distance is the Lolo flow. So it's one area which is my favorite spot. This is near Elberton, Washington, about 7 miles northeast of Colfax. Very small community, very quiet. This photograph's in September. You see it's at low water. The Palouse River here is at low water. It's a very nice, quiet area. And for me, I can't see any rocks hardly in the Pullman area, Moscow area. So I oftentimes led field trips over to this area along the Palouse River. Well, the talk today is on the Palouse Basin boundaries. If you're interested in details, there is a manuscript posted on the PBAC webpage. This original work was done last year by myself, Steve Robuchon, who's attached to PBAC, and my wife and colleague, Pamela Dunlap. So this is a summary, a short summary of about what those boundaries, how those boundaries were determined, and we can also interject a few pieces of general information that lays the groundwork for the lectures that follow. So what we're going to do is we're going to go a little bit over the history of the name, and we'll primarily talk about the present map extent, the basis for that map extent. I'll talk about 4 different areas of the Palouse Basin, which we will talk about, including one that's actually not outside, it's actually outside the basin, but important to keep in our minds. The Moscow-Pullman Basin, the cities of Palouse, Colfax, and the Union Flat Creek areas, and then make a couple conclusions. It's to produce a basis again for our understanding the whole system. And even though today we're talking about the boundaries, it's an important part of the conceptual model. What are the reasons that we chose the boundaries? It tells us a little bit about the general hydrology. The history of the name is kind of interesting. The people were concerned about the water level drop way back in the 1940s. So the committee met off and on for years. It had the name Moscow-Pullman Basin. In the mid-90s, the present committee name was proposed and accepted. It's called the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee, for short, PBAC. In the early 2000s, people started to ask, wait a minute, what is the Palouse Basin? Where's our boundaries? So kind of a group of people went together to form what were our boundaries. Frida Leak had done the most work at that time, and so her work was used as a basis. I was consulted for my ideas. Steve Robuchon was the one collecting some of the ideas. Comments were from experts, and we had political input about where these boundaries are. It wasn't totally based on geology or hydrology. Somewhere from 2017 to 2013, a lot of publications from research supported in part or in whole by PBAC created numerous student theses, reports, and publications. Some of these got peer review, and the term Palouse Basin was used throughout, and very common word in the Moscow-Pullman area now. However, when we got into 2013, 2022, a lot of the publications, a lot of the reports went out for peer review in national and international publications. And those reviewers oftentimes did not like the term Palouse Basin, so the name wasn't always used. Some of those publications would define their Pacific area study, like on Moscow Mountain, and not even refer to the term Palouse Basin. So in recent years, more people raised the question about what is the Palouse Basin actually, where is it? And we have here a diagram that we put together. The red areas shows a diagram you may see in many publications and handouts and so forth of where the Palouse Basin is outlined in red. That's generally been the illustration used in theses, local publications for many years. The problem was it's not really a geologic term. It's not a geologic basin. It's not a geographic basin. Geographers tend to think of drainage systems as being a basin area. So when we went to work on this last year, reviewing publications, particularly the ones from 2007 up to recent time, we eliminated the Colfax area shown here in hatched areas. That was based primarily on the fact that the Colfax water levels, Colfax long-term decline, water decline records, the subsurface expression of the Grand Ronde basalts, they didn't match with those in the Pullman area, and there was never any really information showing that they were connected. So we produced a map you see here before, which is a lot smaller area. And let's talk about that map a little bit. Again, we mentioned the lines are pretty easy to draw where you go against the impermeable basement rocks. In terms of the impermeable basement rocks, just keep in mind that those around the southern, and down where my cursor is at now, down what we call the Bald Butte area. Bald Butte is southwest of Pullman. As you follow around the granites, they're not high elevation, but a granite rock, 30 impermeable rocks, they're not in the basin. You come up around Moscow and you get up into the Moscow area, the Moscow Mountain area, Twin Buttes. Those are granites, protrude above the aquifer system. The granites are not very permeable, although they do create a different type of overburden than the quartzites. As we follow this cursor around, you'll find that the basement rocks now, like an Angel Butte, where the cursor's at now, or over at Kamiak Butte, or down at Smoot Hill, those areas are underlain by quartzite. They're also impermeable, probably more impermeable. They're very tight quartzites, very resistant. Water's only in a very few fractures, very few wells ever identified or occurred or developed in the quartzites, and they produce a different type of regolith on top. They're well-sorted sands, not very thick. But those areas are easy to determine where the boundaries are at. Relatively easy as long as you have enough data. Get down here, just jump down to the Snake River and notice this straight line we have along there. That's another boundary that's fairly well defendable. It seems logical that the groundwater would move from Pullman to the exposures of those aquifers along the Snake River, but the water is not flowing out of those contacts. Wells along the edge, historical wells that farmers used to drill back in the past, I shouldn't say used to drill, were pretty much deep and dry. So it was determined through various other reports that the water is not getting to the Snake River, so that boundary is a fairly defendable boundary. As you go from start getting away from the Snake River and go across what we call the Union Flat Creek area, this line here is drawn primarily on data that tells us that the water levels have dropped. So that boundary is from what data we have, and it's scarce in a couple places. We will talk about the fact that through the years, you have to adjust the boundaries. One of the adjustments we made was that the potlatch area is not included in the Palouse Basin. Down here to the southeast, as you head up the drainage of the Union Flat Creek towards Genesee, Idaho, we drew a line across there, primarily a little bit on the lack of data, because we didn't have any lower aquifer wells east of that line. And I should mention that the aquifer system is based on similar water levels within the lower aquifer. We also used geology, other records to tell us about whether we were connected. The idea of the Palouse Basin is what areas are interconnected are connected to the Palouse pumping center or the Moscow pumping centers. Well, we got down here to Colton and we kind of lost track of data. Recently, there was a well drilled in Genesee, way over in Idaho, in the same drainage system that has a similar water level to those in the Palouse Basin. It will take a couple years to find out whether that that area is connected. So you might see this line change. It's not a big addition to the in terms of square miles, but it may have to be added to what we call the Palouse Basin. But we need some data. You need more than just similar water levels. You need similar water levels. You need matching water decline records. You need the geological data to see if it is possible that they are connected. So at the present time, PBAC is looking into putting a monitor, a well monitor, water level monitor in that Genesee well. So it'll take a couple of years, maybe 5 or so, to see whether in fact those water levels do respond to pumping from our pumping centers in Pullman and Moscow. So we always have to expect adjustments. You see now, oops, gotta give me a second here. I sometimes get confused on how to jump up the next slide. So the basis for the map extent, the present map extent, is it's only based on the lower aquifer connections, on the assumption that similar water levels mean the areas are interconnected. I might mention that just because all this area we've shown here is about interconnections for the lower aquifer. That is true. It does not mean that the connections are the same everywhere. For example, out here in what we call the Union Flat Creek area out in the west, those connections, just because they have similar water levels, doesn't mean it has the same hydrological parameters as up here in Pullman and Moscow. The same for across the Palouse. We have extensive evidence that proves we are connected to the city of Palouse. We've yet to figure out what's the nature of those connections. Is there a large connection? There is information from geophysical data, from geologic data, comparing wells, that there is about 600 feet minimum of Columbia River basalts and sediments that extend across what we call the Butte Gap area. So the areas are connected, basically proved by similar water levels, water decline records, but we don't know the nature of that connection. What I mean by the nature, is it well connected or partially connected? One of the confusing parts about trying to put together a model on the area, and interesting parts, the lower aquifer system has all of these similar water levels, and yet pump test data tells it's compartmentalized, very compartmentalized in resources. 2 wells close to each other may or may not show significant connection during a pump test. Yet one of the wells may be connected to another well very significantly 3 miles away. So the fact that it's interconnected does not always mean they have the same hydrological properties throughout the basin. And the data for putting the lines is not just hydrology, but also geology and long-term water level records. So that's how we put the data together. One sidetrack from our lecture today is to look at the location of some of the all important wells. I didn't point out earlier that the model is put together. One of the things that we used was we looked at over close to 700 outcrops and well data, mostly well data. Well, it boggles my mind to keep track of them. In a lecture series, it would not be possible to keep track of them. So I just want to point out the locations of the key wells that we will refer to the most. The Butte Gap well is an observation well way up here to the north. Kemiak Butte's this little green area over on the left. Angel Butte's this little green spot right here. Those are quartzites sticking up above our aquifer systems. So the gap is where the water is connected up to Palouse. That well is referred to a lot. We don't have a lot of deep wells out here in the central part of the basin, enough to make correlations, however. So we make a lot of correlations up to the Butte Gap well because that's where we have contacts that are pinpointed by detailed research and chemical analysis of the basalt flow. So we're referring to that well a lot. And of course, the cities. Moscow is our pumping center, one of the pumping centers. So we refer to wells in that area, and we draw a lot of cross sections east-west from Moscow to Pullman through the DOE Pullman test and observation well, which is a 900-foot well between the two cities. And we draw a lot of east-west cross sections across there, but we're going to be drawing cross sections from the from the Pullman East test and observation well. We'll be drawing some of those up to the Moscow Mountain area. We'll be drawing some of those up to Albion. We're drawing some of those to the Banter well to see what the subsurface is like. And we have, using domestic wells down into the lower aquifer system, we have a cross section going all the way up to the DOE well. So those are the wells we refer to a lot. Another well we refer to a lot because it was a well, two wells actually. Here I have the DOE City Yard well number 1. It's got good, precise contacts between the aquifer layers. It's partially part of the data information comes from an outcrop right there. If you're not familiar with that area, this is where what I call the Pullman maintenance area. If you drive up the road from downtown Pullman up over to the Hilltop Restaurant and on out to Colfax, you can look down into the little valley of the South Fork of the Palouse, and you'll see a big white building down there. That's where the city yard well is, what I refer to as the city yard well. And we'll use that well a lot. The observation wells, these are also wells, by the way, that have been surveyed in and have precise locations. So there are control wells. For example, if I drill a well, or if I look at a well report up here by the airport, just north of the airport, and I can identify the contacts, but I don't have any geochemistry on the rocks, I will compare it to the Palouse test and observation well, where we have good control on the contacts, where we have geochemistry from the rock layers. And so these are our control wells. We'll also refer way out here to the DOE landfill well. There were 3 wells drilled out here in 2013, I believe, in what I call the Union Flat Creek area. That well is a key for correlating east to west. For our major cross-section, detailed cross-section, goes east to west from Moscow to Pullman, and it kicks a little bit for about 4 miles to the northwest up to the DOE landfill. That well is located near the Whitman County landfill area, and it is right alongside the road as you go towards Colfax. The Albion Town Well 3 sits right against the quartzites. In fact, it bottoms out in quartzites of Smoot Hill area, and we'll refer to that well a lot. Occasionally, we might refer to Moscow City 10. Moscow City 10 is right on as close as you can get to the boundary with the state of Washington, and we'll refer to data from that well quite often. Steve Robuchon just mentioned that about the Moscow City well to me, that it's been pumped for a long time. We've drilled in 1955, if I recall. That well has been pumped very much consistently through the years out of the lower aquifer. It's coming from a inner bed, primarily from an inner bed, referred to as the sediments of Moscow. Presently, Steve tells me that that well is, the pump's going to have to be pulled and repaired, or a new pump put down in it. So for the time being, they may be going back to pump Moscow City 2, which is in the upper aquifer. I think I told you in the first lecture that pumping from that upper aquifer, municipal water from that upper aquifer, ended in 2017. But he says it looks like they're considering going back and pumping that well. One other well we might refer to is what's called UI7. There's actually 3 wells there. They're called the aquaculture wells. Because of the nature of the pump test, it tells us a lot about how the upper aquifer corresponds. So I hope that gives you a little idea, rather than trying to keep in your head all these 700 outcrops and primarily well locations. I hope that helps a little bit. The only place we can have any decent outcrops other than the low flow is here just at the Doe City Yard well. The Grand Ron, top of the Grand Ron is exposed and the Vantage is exposed, the only outcrop of those in the entire area. I think that's enough of looking at the well systems. Let's look at a brief comparison of the area. Sometimes we refer to as areas rather than the whole Palouse Basin. We talked about Colfax is no longer considered to be in the Palouse Basin, but we've done a lot of studies over there, a lot of looking at well logs, a lot of look at the outcrops. So there's some information that comes from that. What's interesting is you look at this drainage here, look how it's all to the southwest. So I generally think of the Colfax area as a different block, a different area, particularly structure. The basalt slowly slope to the southeast, and the drainage follows the slope. In the Palouse area, Moscow-Pullman Basin, excuse me, the drainages flow to the west, east-west, trying to get out of what we call the Moscow-Pullman Basin. And that definition is sort of a geologic term. It's the context, it's the edges of the basement rocks that are not continuous, because you have a gap here at Palouse, you have a small gap at 4 Mile, and you have a big gap on down through Pullman. But in general, it's an area encircled by discontinuous impermeable rocks. And geologically, it's been referred to in the literature as the Moscow-Pullman Basin. The other area of importance is out here to the west of Pullman. It has similar water levels out of the lower aquifer, from lower observation wells in the lower aquifer system. It does not have any producing wells, no major producing wells, but the observation wells tell us that it has the same static levels, similar static levels, similar water declines as the area in the Moscow-Pullman Basin and the city of Palouse. So we're talking about the Union Flat Creek area. What you should notice is when you jump out of the Moscow-Pullman Basin, that the drainage just suddenly changed from east-west to northwest. So this area is, to me, including the part of the, including the Snake River, all these rivers, all these drainages are going to the northwest. That's because they're in a block, a structural area in which all the rocks and all the sediments slope or dip to the northwest. So 4 different areas that we'll talk about. The funds will We'll focus on is the Moscow-Pullman Basin out to the Union Flat Creek, because we can draw some good east-west cross-sections. But we will at times talk about the city of Palouse, and outside our basin, we should not forget the Colfax area, because there's some information that comes from that area. Let me see. How to get down here to the last slide. Next to the last slide. So just remember the extent of the Palouse Basin aquifer system. On this one, I put a couple questions. We did this last spring. I should now have a couple of questions right down here west of Colton. But there are some areas that our data may not have been sufficient to accurately draw the line. The other areas we feel pretty confident about. So just keep in mind that there will be adjustments down in the future as we get some more information. And we get down to the conclusions. So what I should have got across is that the boundaries include, of the Palouse Basin, include known areas of the lower aquifer connections, and the boundaries are defendable as a groundwater basin, but not as a geologic basin, not as a geographic basin, but a groundwater basin for the lower aquifer. In the future, you should expect some adjustments to these boundaries, and they should, however, help focus our attention to where we may or may not need to do more research. The next talk is on the origin of the Columbia River basalts. It's a little bit longer, but it will point out certain keys that will help us down through the lecture series. Thank you for your attention today, and we'll see you at the next lecture.